The Galactic Conclave met once every 7 years on the neutral world of Varath Prime, a cold, pale planet sitting between three star systems chosen specifically because no single species had any historical claim to it. The Great Hall where the delegates gathered was built to make everyone feel small. Its ceilings rose 40 meters above the floor. Its walls were carved from translucent white stone that scattered incoming light into soft drifting color. And its central table stretched long enough that a delegate sitting at one end could barely see the face of a delegate sitting at the other. That year, the agenda was serious. A newly discovered star cluster, dense with dark matter deposits and perfectly positioned between four major shipping lanes, had been opened for territorial negotiation. UN 47 spacefaring species had sent their representatives to Varath Prime to make their case. No species sent a weak delegate to an event like this. The Krethon arrived first and loudest. They came through the main entrance in a column of 8, each one standing close to 3 meters tall, on their bodies covered in overlapping plates of natural silicon armor that had grown directly from their skin through decades of military conditioning. Their footsteps hit the stone floor in a slow, heavy rhythm that echoed through the hall like something between a march and a warning. Their leader was Warlord Speaker Grudak, old by Krethon standards, which made him roughly as old as a medium-sized geological formation. He moved slowly not because he was weak, but because he had lived long enough to know that nothing required rushing, and he looked around the great hall with the calm, measuring expression of a being who had spent his entire life being the most dangerous thing in any given room. Other species filed in behind them. The Ulari came in neat coordinated pairs, their blue skin catching the scattered light from the walls. The Veth drifted in above the floor on low-field levitation pads, their communication humming at frequencies that sat just below hearing. The Dravek wore ceremonial blades purely for appearance and still managed to be unsettling about it. Each species filling the hall with weight, presence, and the quiet message that they were not something to be taken lightly. Then the door opened again, and the human delegate walked in. Commander Sarah Voss entered alone. No escort, no ceremonial display, or no dramatic entrance. She stood 168 centimeters tall, weighed 68 kilograms, wore a plain dark uniform with a small Earth flag stitched onto the left shoulder, and carried a metal thermos of black coffee. The hall went quiet in the specific way a room goes quiet when something unexpected happens. Not frightened, not excited, just uncertain. Grudak looked at her the way a person looks at a word they do not recognize. Slowly, with the faint suspicion that they should understand it, but somehow do not. Within a minute, someone in the Krethon delegation had quietly pulled Sarah's biometric data from the Conclave's open registry and cast it to the shared diplomatic feed, the one all delegates could access from their wrist panels. The numbers appeared on dozens of screens at once. Low bone density relative to most represented species. Soft exterior body with no natural armor. No venom production. No functional claws. Pain sensitivity rated as high. Physical output strength sitting in the bottom 12. Our percent of all represented species. Average lifespan rated as short. And a biological classification note that read simply, unaugmented, standard, baseline mammal. The laughter came from the Krethon side of the table first and spread outward. Not all species laughed, but enough did that the sound filled the hall, and even the ones who did not laugh were leaning toward their neighbors and speaking in low tones while looking at the numbers on their screens. Sarah walked to the human seat at the table, set her thermos down, pulled out her chair, and sat. She opened her briefing folder and began to read. Grudak watched her for a long moment, then stood. In Krethon diplomatic protocol, standing during an open session meant a formal statement was coming. And the room settled into attention. "I move," he said in the common trade language, his voice carrying the deep, smooth weight of something that had never once needed to be raised to be heard. "That the species registered as Homo sapiens, Earth origin, unaugmented, be formally reclassified under Conclave Charter Article 19 as a protected non-combatant species." Article 19 was not new. It had existed in the Charter for over 200 years, but it was rarely invoked. It had been written originally for species that had reached space travel through outside assistance rather than independent development. and for species whose biological fragility made full conclave participation a practical liability. What it meant in practice was simple. No vote, no territorial rights, no independent standing. A species under Article 19 was a ward of the conclave, documented and protected and completely without power. Several delegates nodded, not cruelly, but with the brisk practicality of beings who read data and acted on it. Sarah turned a page in her briefing folder. The Ulari junior delegate, young and careful with large eyes that moved quickly, leaned toward his senior representative and whispered, "Is she going to say anything?" Sarah looked up from her folder. Not at any one person, just up, at the general direction of the room. The way someone looks up when they have finished a paragraph and are deciding whether to keep reading. "I have no objection to being evaluated," she said. Her voice carried no anger, no performance, no effort. It was simply a voice saying words, evenly, the way water moves over a flat surface. "I ask only that the classification reflects something real. I will accept whatever standing your champion earns for my species in a formal trial by contest." The words fell into the room and sat there. Nobody moved for 3 full seconds. The Ulari junior delegate made a very small sound that he would later deny, making. Grudak stood very still. Not because he was unsure what to do, but because he had realized, 1/2 second too late, when that he had already nodded twice during Sarah's statement. And in Krethon protocol, 2 nods during an open floor challenge was a binding acceptance. The conclave's record system had already logged it. Timestamp, witnesses, formal language, all of it locked into the permanent proceedings archive. There was no procedural path to undo it. The challenge was on the record. The trial by contest was now scheduled. Sarah picked up her thermos, took a long, unhurried sip of her coffee, and went back to her briefing folder. Around her, 46 other delegations sat in varying states of shock and the deeply specific discomfort of beings who have just understood that they may have made a serious miscalculation, but who have not yet begun to understand how serious it actually is. Dr. Thesivane of the Ulari had spent 19 years studying Earth. That was not unusual for an Ulari xenobiologist. Her species approached new civilizations the way others approached puzzles, and with patience and a deep respect for detail. But humans had been a particular focus of hers because they were, in scientific terms, deeply strange. Not dangerous. Strange, just strange. They had no natural weapons of consequence. No armor, no venom, no biological tools that would make a predator hesitate. And yet they had not only survived their home planet's considerable collection of threats, but had in fact driven most of those threats into carefully managed reserves, which was itself a fascinating data point that Thesivane had written 2 papers about. But right now, she was not thinking about managed reserves. She was standing at her research terminal in her private quarters aboard the Ulari diplomatic vessel, which was docked in Varath Prime's orbital ring, and she was pulling every scrap of human biological and cultural data she had ever collected and reading it with new eyes, with the specific new eyes of someone who had just watched a small, soft, eon-augmented mammal formally challenge the Krethon's greatest fighter to single combat and then go back to reading a briefing folder. Something was not adding up. The biological data said, fragile, but something in the way Commander Voss had spoken, the absence of fear in her voice, the stillness in her body, the way her hand had been completely steady when she picked up that thermos, said something that the data was not capturing. Thesivane pulled the human physical culture files. She had always categorized these under primitive ritual behavior and pre-space developmental sports history. She had given them roughly the same attention she gave pre-industrial hunting records from other species, which was to say, almost none. She opened them now and started reading from the beginning. By the time she reached the 3rd document, she had already stopped breathing normally. Humans broke their bones on purpose. Not accidentally, not in war or through environmental hazard, but deliberately, systematically, as part of a structured physical practice. They would subject the bones of their limbs and spines to loads heavy enough to create microscopic fractures. Then, they would rest and feed the damage, and the bone would regrow denser than before, stronger, more resistant to impact. And then they would do it again. They had been doing this for thousands of years. The muscle data was worse or more impressive, depending entirely on the point of view of the reader. Humans deliberately tore their own muscle fiber through extreme exertion, then fed the tears with calculated nutrition and rest, and the muscle rebuilt itself larger and with greater force output, not by a small margin either. A trained human's muscle density and output strength was so far beyond the baseline readings in the conclave registry that they were practically different biological entries. The baseline numbers in the registry, the ones that had appeared on all those screens in the Great Hall and drawn laughter from half the room, were taken from unexercised, non-trained adult humans living ordinary civilian lives. The numbers were not wrong, they were just catastrophically incomplete. Thesivane pulled the pain response data next and found the piece of information that made her sit down slowly in her chair and stare at the wall for a long moment. Every known spacefaring species had some version of a pain submission reflex, a biological signal, deep in the nervous system. That communicated a simple and important message. The damage being done to this body is serious. Stop, submit, withdraw. This reflex existed because it was logical. It prevented fatal overexertion. It was a safety mechanism, and every species that had evolved in a competitive environment had developed some version of it. Humans had it too, but they had spent 3,000 years practicing not listening to it. Thesivane read the full history of human combat sports. The documented, a formalized, celebrated practice of two humans entering a defined space and subjecting each other to controlled physical force for competition. She found records going back to ancient civilizations on Earth's surface, traditions that had never stopped but had instead grown more refined and more technical across every culture on every continent. Generation after generation building on the one before, passing down not just technique, but the specific mental and physical habit of moving toward pain rather than away from it. The scale of it was not easy to absorb. These were not fringe practices, not specialized military programs or extreme outlier behaviors. These were things that billions of humans did voluntarily, watched eagerly, and taught their children about with open pride. Entire industries, entire careers, entire cultural identities built around the deliberate cultivation of physical capability and the trained suppression of self-protective instinct. Thesivane found records of children, human children, some as young as 5 years of age, being taught to fall without injury, to absorb impact, to stand back up and try again. And she found records of the adults those children became and what they were capable of. And she set those records next to the baseline biometric file that the conclave registry held on humanity and felt, for the first time in her 19-year career, genuinely embarrassed on behalf of her own field. The adrenal response data was the last piece under extreme stress. The human body released a chemical cascade that temporarily suspended the body's own safety limiters. A human in a full adrenal state could exert force that actively damaged their own joints and tissue. And because their pain submission reflex had been trained into near silence, they often did not stop when this happened, they simply kept going. Thesivane wrote the message to Grudak quickly. She was not a dramatic person by nature, but she found herself typing faster than usual, and the words came out plain and urgent. Do not let the trial proceed. I have made a critical error in my data classification, and I believe your delegation has as well. The human biometrics on file are baseline civilian measurements taken from non-trained individuals. They do not reflect what a prepared and conditioned specimen is capable of. I am attaching the full corrected file. Please read it before the arena session begins. She sent the message. Then she checked the conclave schedule and felt something cold settle in her chest. The trial was scheduled for the following morning at the first session. Bell. It was currently 3 hours before that bell. She sent the message a second time, marked urgent, with a priority flag that would light up Grudak's wrist panel red and send an audible chime to his quarters. Then she sat at her terminal and kept reading. Not because there was anything she could do now, but because she was a scientist, and scientists finish what they start. And because some part of her, the part that had spent 19 years studying a species that kept finding new ways to surprise her, needed to understand the full shape of what she had missed. The files kept going. The more she read, the quieter she became. By the time the message light on Grudak's wrist panel finally turned red, it was 14 minutes before the bell. He was already in the arena. Vorith the Unbroken had been in military service for 31 years. He had received his first enhancement procedure at age 12, a standard Crethon military program that began with calcium density treatments and progressed, over the following 2 decades, through muscle fiber restructuring, joint reinforcement, reflex amplification, and a full neural response upgrade that reduced his reaction time to roughly 1/3 of an unaugmented Crethon baseline. He weighed 340 kilograms. Every gram of that weight was the product of a program that the Crethon military had refined over 4 centuries, and it had produced in Vorith one of the most physically capable beings in the Conclave's recorded history. He had ended a border conflict 6 years ago by personally destroying the opposing side's lead shuttle with his hands, pulling its hull apart at the seams until the crew surrendered. And the story had become the kind of thing young Crethon soldiers told each other, the way other species told stories about gods. He stood at the far end of the arena floor and looked across at the human. The arena was a circular space 40 meters across, enclosed under a dome of clear material so that every delegate in the surrounding gallery could see without obstruction. Every seat was filled. The conclave-wide feed was broadcasting to affiliated systems across 14 star clusters. Somewhere between 3 and 4 billion beings were watching the live stream. And the general expectation across most of those systems was that this was going to be brief. The Ulari senior delegate had quietly pressed his junior colleague's arm at the start of the session and said, very softly, "You do not have to watch." The junior delegate watched anyway. Grudak sat in the Crethon gallery box above the arena floor. He had read Thesavane's message 20 minutes ago, all of it, and he had sat with it for the full 20 minutes without speaking or moving, which for Grudak was as close to visible distress as anyone who knew him had ever witnessed. There was nothing to be done. The record was locked. The proceedings were formal. Stopping the trial now would require both parties to formally withdraw, and Sarah Voss had not given any indication that she intended to withdraw anything. He watched her walk onto the arena floor. She moved the way people move when they are not thinking about how they move. Easily, yet without performance. She wore the same plain dark uniform she had worn in the diplomatic hall, which meant she had not changed into anything specialized, and she carried the thermos, which she set down very carefully just inside the arena boundary before walking to the center. She set it down carefully. That small detail, the care with which she placed a coffee container before entering a fight with a 340-kilogram enhanced military being, did something unusual to the mood in the gallery. Something that was difficult to name. It was not funny. It was something else. The specific and creeping unease that comes from watching a person behave with complete comfort in a situation where comfort makes no logical sense. Vorith walked to the center from his side of the floor. Up close, the difference in scale between them was extreme. He was more than twice her mass and nearly twice her height. He looked at her with an expression that sat somewhere between contempt and genuine confusion. The look of a being who was trying to categorize something and finding that his categories were not quite working. The arena clock on the gallery wall counted down 40 seconds. 30. Sarah rolled her neck. One slow roll left, on one right. Then rolled her shoulders back and shook out her hands. Fingers loose, the motion automatic and unhurried. The motion of someone running through a pre-task routine they have performed so many times that it requires no thought. Not preparing herself psychologically, not building up to something. Just checking that everything was where she expected it to be. The way a carpenter checks their tools before starting work. 20 seconds. Vorith looked at her and said something in Crethon. The translator rendered it as, "Are you frightened, small thing?" Sarah did not answer. She was not looking at his face. She was reading the forward pitch of his center of gravity, the way his weight sat slightly ahead of his feet, a posture common in beings whose mass made quick backward movement slow and costly. She was reading his dominant side, now which was his right, based on the 3-centimeter height difference between his hips and the slight rightward lean of his standing stance. And she had already found what she was looking for. A gap below his left shoulder joint where 2 overlapping plates of natural armor met imperfectly. A space roughly the width of her spread hand, or unprotected and positioned at exactly the height she needed. She had been reading him since he walked onto the floor. 10 seconds. Vorath turned his head slightly to check the countdown clock. A small movement, automatic, the kind any being makes when counting down to something. Sarah moved. She did not wait for the bell. She closed the distance between them in less than 1 second. Not a charge, not a signal, and not a wind-up. Just a sudden and complete commitment of her entire body in one direction, low and fast, her center of gravity dropping as she moved so that she arrived already inside his reach before his neural upgrade had finished processing that she had left her position. Her shoulder drove into the back of his left knee with the full, transferred momentum of her sprint. Her right arm drove upward simultaneously, and finding the gap below his left shoulder joint as precisely as if she had marked it in advance, which, in every way that mattered, she had. The bell rang. Nobody heard it. What the gallery heard was the sound of Vorath the Unbroken hitting the arena floor. And then the sounds that followed, which were controlled and deliberate and carried the specific rhythm of someone completing a task they have rehearsed 10,000 times in training halls and competition spaces and early mornings before anyone else was awake. Vorath did not stop fighting. That point is important. He fought with everything his 31 years of enhancement and military experience had given him. And it was considerable. And it was not nothing. He simply could not find her. Every time he oriented toward her, she was already somewhere else. And every angle he reached from, something came back at him from a direction his training had not fully prepared him for. Not because she was faster in absolute terms, but because she was specifically unpredictable in the way that only comes from years of fighting opponents much larger than yourself and building a personal library of exactly what works in exactly these conditions. She was not improvising. She had done this before. She had done versions of this thousands of times. At 47 seconds, it was over. Vorath was alive. She had been precise about that, deliberate about it in the same way she had been deliberate about everything else. But he was in two distinct locations on the arena floor. And when the Crethon medic team came through the arena door, they looked at the situation and then looked at each other, and then one of them went back out and came back with a second stretcher. Two stretchers. For one being, the gallery watched this happen in total silence. The first thing that happened after the 47 seconds was nothing. Not a sound, not a movement. The gallery sat in total silence for a stretch of time that felt much longer than it was. And the conclave feed kept broadcasting, and somewhere across 14 star clusters approximately 3.7 billion beings also sat in silence watching the arena floor. The two stretchers were the image that stayed with people, not the fight itself. The feed's editorial systems had processed the speed of it in a way that made some of the key moments hard to follow in real time. But the stretchers were slow and clear and comprehensible, and they said something to every watching being that did not require translation or context or any special understanding of human biology. It just said, that happened. Sarah walked to the edge of the arena boundary, picked up her thermos, and took a long, slow sip. Then she walked back to the diplomatic table, sat down, opened her briefing folder, and found the page she had been on before the trial. She kept reading. It took 3 full minutes before anyone else in the gallery moved. The first person to move was the Ulari Junior delegate, who stood and then immediately sat back down because his legs were unsteady. The second was a Veth representative who drifted sideways on his levitation pad by about a meter, in which for a Veth was the physical equivalent of needing to sit down. Grudak remained in his gallery box without speaking. He had read Thesavane's file. He understood now, intellectually, the shape of what had happened. But understanding something in a file and watching it occur in front of you are two different experiences. And he was, for the first time in a very long time, processing something he had genuinely failed to anticipate. The conclave feed eventually cut to the general session signal, the standard chime that indicated formal proceedings were resuming. And slowly, one by one, the delegates returned to their seats. Dr. Thesavane was already at her terminal, writing, not a message this time. A paper, formal and complete, with a title she had been composing in her head since approximately the 30-second mark of the fight. On the systematic undervaluation of biological suffering, tolerance as a strategic variable in conclave species assessment. The paper's central argument was this. The conclave's species classification system measured natural biological assets, claws, armor, venom, size, raw baseline strength, and assigned standing accordingly. What it did not measure, had in fact never thought to measure, was what a species had done with its limitations over its full history of development. Specifically, the degree to which a species had identified its own biological constraints and then built entire cultural and physical traditions specifically designed to push through them. Humans had not evolved better bones. They had decided their bones were insufficient and then spent 3,000 years making them better on purpose. The distinction, Thesivane wrote, was not minor. She sent the paper to the conclave's open scientific registry before dawn. By mid-morning, it had been downloaded 400,000 times. In the gallery session that followed the trial, Grudik stood and spoke briefly, without ceremony, in a flat and honest voice. He said that the motion under Article 19 had been made on the basis of incomplete data, that the data he had relied upon did not accurately reflect the species in question, and that he was formally withdrawing the motion and would be casting the first affirmative vote for full humanity conclave membership. He did not phrase it as an apology. He phrased it as a correction, which in Krethon culture carried the same weight. Sarah received it with a single nod, and the matter was closed. What happened in the following days was quieter than the trial, but in some ways more significant. A Veth delegation analyst submitted a formal request to have the Veth species' own conclave classification reviewed. The Veth had been rated in the middle tier for 3 centuries, primarily on the basis of their low physical mass and their non-combat cultural history. The analyst's request pointed out that the conclave had never assessed Veth deep space navigational cognition, which was not measured by any standard registry metric and which, in comparative piloting trials conducted within the Veth's own systems, it consistently outperformed the best available mechanical navigation systems by a significant margin. 2 other species submitted similar review requests within the week. A small, quiet species called the Perith, gray-skinned, large-eyed, roughly the height of an earth heron, had been a conclave observer species for 200 years, never applying for full membership, always at the edge of proceedings with the specific posture of beings who had been told, in many ways over many years, that they did not quite belong. After the trial, their senior delegate spent 6 straight hours in the conclave library reading their own species file, with an expression that a watching Ulari librarian later described simply as someone who has just found something they did not know they had lost. When a journalist from the conclave press corps caught Sarah in the hallway between sessions and asked, the question they had all been circling since the arena floor, what her secret was, she considered it the way she considered everything, without hurry. The body tells you to stop before it actually has to, she said. We just practiced not listening, for a long time, and very seriously, and then we made it competitive because humans tend to do that with everything. The journalist stared at her. That is, the journalist said, very slowly, a profoundly unsettling thing to hear. Sarah considered this genuinely. We find it motivating, she said, and picked up her thermos and walked away. The journalist stood in the hallway for a full minute after she left, staring at nothing, and then went back to their desk and wrote a piece that would become the most widely read article in the conclave press feed's 300-year history. Not because it said anything dramatic, but because it explained, calmly and clearly, saw what the biometric numbers in the open registry had failed to say. And because beings across 14 star clusters read it and then looked at their own species files and began, quietly, to wonder what their own numbers were not saying about them. The galaxy had been talking about the fight for days, but the fight was not actually the point. The fight was just the first sentence of a much longer conversation that nobody had known they needed to have. 3 weeks after the trial, the full conclave membership vote for humanity passed with 39 affirmative votes, 4 abstentions, and 4 species who had been so thoroughly unsettled by the preceding weeks that they submitted written votes rather than attending the ratification session in person, a procedure that the conclave's administrative staff had to look up in the archive because it had not been done in 60 years. Commander Sarah Voss was formally appointed Earth's first conclave ambassador at standing at a brief ceremony the following morning. She attended in her plain dark uniform, received her credentials, thanked the presiding officer in the common trade language and in three secondary diplomatic dialects, and then asked whether the refreshment station near the East Gallery had been restocked, because she had visited it the previous Tuesday, and it had been out of the good tea, and she had wanted to mention it to someone, the presiding officer, a senior Dravic bureaucrat who had been conducting formal conclave ceremonies for 40 years, later told his assistant that in 40 years, he had never once been asked about tea availability at a credentials ceremony, and that he genuinely could not decide how to feel about it. The night before the ratification vote, something else had happened, quieter and in some ways more important than any of the formal proceedings. The observation deck on the upper level of the conclave complex was not officially a social space. It was a transit corridor between two administrative wings, but its outer wall was entirely transparent and looked out over the atmosphere of Varath Prime, above the cloud line, where the planet's three moons were visible simultaneously, and the rings of the outer gas giant caught the distant star's light and spread it in long, slow arcs of pale color. Grudak was standing there when Sarah came through the door. She had not known he would be there, or if she had suspected it, she had not said so to anyone. She simply arrived with her thermos and stopped when she saw him. And they stood together for a moment in the specific silence of two people who have had a significant shared experience and have not yet found the right words for it. "May I ask you something?" Grudak said. Not quite a question, but phrased with the Kreth-on courtesy form that meant, "I will ask regardless. But I am acknowledging your right to refuse." "Go ahead," Sarah said. "Were you afraid?" he said. She was quiet for long enough that he thought she might not answer. She looked out at the rings of the gas giant, and the rings moved in their slow, indifferent arc, and she said, "Yes, every time. That is the whole point of it." Grudak was still. "The fear tells you it matters," she said. "If you were not afraid, then you would not be paying full attention. And if you are not paying full attention, then you have already made a mistake. We train so that the fear does not make the decisions, but we do not train it away. You train it away and you get careless." Grudak looked at his hands. Large, plated, the hands of a being who had ended conflicts by force and had never doubted the outcome. "I did not account for that," he said. "Most people don't," she said, and there was no judgment in it. There was a silence that was, somehow, comfortable, the kind that sometimes grows between two soldiers who recognize something in each other across a very significant cultural distance. "Are all humans like you?" he asked. She made a short sound that was not quite a laugh. "No, most humans are not fighters at all. Some of them could be, and chose something else entirely." "Chose something else," he said. "Doctors," she said. "Engineers, architects, teachers, scientists. The ones who had everything I have and decided the most important thing they could do with it was something other than fight. A person who becomes a surgeon instead of a soldier is not less capable. They are making a different argument about where capability belongs. And those are the ones I would think about honestly, if I were you. The ones who are soft on purpose. The ones who could do what I do and chose to build things instead or heal things, or figure things out. That is not weakness. That is a decision about what the strength is for." Grudak stood with that for a long time. The moons of Varath Prime moved in their slow orbits. "I will not read only the biology again," he said finally. "That is all I ask," she said. She finished her coffee. Two beings stood in a corridor that was not officially a social space, and looked out at the same view and thought about different things that were, in the end, about the same question, the question of what a thing is versus what it has decided to become, and whether those two answers are ever the same. 3 months after the ratification, Sarah submitted a formal proposal to the Conclave Floor A working group, to be called the Reevaluation Initiative, tasked with reviewing the biological and cultural classifications of all species currently rated below the 3rd tier of conclave standing, with specific attention to capabilities the standard registry had never been designed to measure. The proposal passed the Parath species, the gray, heron-shaped observers who had spent 200 years at the edge of proceedings, sent a delegation to the initiative's first meeting, and sat at the actual table for the first time in their entire conclave history, which their senior delegate noted, in a quiet speech that most of the room leaned forward to hear. And it was the first time they had sat at a table like this and not felt that their chair might be taken away. Other species followed. The conclave's great hall began to sound different. More voices, different rhythms, arguments, and proposals coming from directions that had been silent for generations. Sarah sat at the center of it, not because she was the loudest or the most decorated, but because she listened, and which it turned out was rarer and more valuable than most of the things the hall had historically rewarded. One afternoon, late in the third month, a small amphibian delegate from a world called HFY submitted a request to address the full-floor. HFY had been an observer species for 300 years, rarely mentioned, occasionally documented in passing, generally forgotten between sessions. The delegate was small and green-gray and moved with the careful, deliberate slowness of a being that was very aware of how it appeared to others and had spent a long time trying to take up as little space as possible. Sarah was the first delegate to turn fully in her chair to face the speaker. She opened her notebook. She picked up her pen and she wrote down every word, because that was what humanity had learned to do. Not just to endure, not just to fight and win and prove the data wrong, but to pay attention, to stay at the table, so to keep writing things down and asking what was being missed. And it turned out that in a galaxy full of species who had spent centuries talking, the most powerful thing a person could do was simply refuse to stop listening. Humanity had arrived, and they were not going anywhere.